I entrusted myself to a bus this evening, which was a huge mistake. I had a very good tour of some bits of York I never knew existed, and eventually it deposited me within 20 minutes walk of York. I mean, it said University Campus on the bus, but then it said East Campus. I, being a deluded non-local, was fooled by this. So then I ran very quickly down from what I took to be the nearest point that the bus was going to get to this venue, and I would have made it. I was doing that Google Maps thing where you're racing the app. The app tells you it's going to take you 14 minutes, so you're going to arrive at 18:19. Think, oh my God, I'm supposed to be speaking at 18:15, so you hurry along. And I was actually due to arrive here at 18:13 when, unfortunately, I had a little help and saw every side of this building except the right side. And now, at last, here I am. So, I hope that you don't feel as hurried and rushed as I do, because one of my favourite quotations from one of my favourite philosophers is Wittgenstein's remark that philosophers should greet each other with "take your time," instead of saying "good morning," or "hello," or "how are you," or "where's that £5 you owe me?" They should say, "take your time." And I think very often we live in a society that encourages us to be little hamsters on our wheels. And I do think that philosophy should be, whatever else it is, a chance to sit back, take a deep breath, stop thinking about politics. Oh my God, the politics. Stop thinking about politics and take a larger view. And so that's what I'd like to do today. Some of the things I say in this book, which I published in 2022, with the subtitle, An Ethics of Human Experience. Some of the things I say in this book are quite polemical, and one of the polemics that I tend to engage in is a polemic raising worries about the way we typically do, moral theory, because this whole project of mine emerged from thinking about the way I was doing moral theory and thinking that it was perhaps a little bit yet another way of being caught on a hamster wheel, and yet another way of being caught in a production and reward cycle, and thinking that philosophy perhaps ought to be about something else rather than just that, and trying to think seriously about what else it might be about and what it might mean to do philosophy. I was going to say in 2024, but actually I'm not sure I want that ending to the sentence, because I think there'd better be truths about what's a good way of doing philosophy that aren't time-indexed, that aren't local to particular positions in history or time or, oh God, politics. So at the same time as that, I do want something that's rooted in history, rooted in where we are, rooted in the here and now. So I started thinking about trying to square that circle and about what it might be to have a philosophy which was both, in some sense, universal and also thoroughly local. And so I honed in on the notion of an epiphany. I found my thoughts heading in that direction, and I began to think, maybe this is a useful direction to be headed in, because maybe this is a direction, production and reward again, maybe this is a direction that not many other people are looking in. Maybe I'll get some professional brownie points for being the philosopher who talks about epiphanies. And philosophers as a profession, those of you who are not actually professional philosophers yourselves, you may not realize quite how obsessed with brownie points philosophy as a profession now has to be, because the university is, so we're bound to be, and we're all caught in the machinery, a machinery in which I myself am something like the good concentration camp guard. The machinery is something called the Research Excellence Framework, which judges us on our productivity for originality, significance, and rigor. So you score big on originality if you come up with a discussion of something that no one's ever talked about before. So all of this led me to think, hang on a minute, we're all sitting here doing moral theory in the usual ways, talking about promoting utility, or talking about observing universal principles, or talking about trying to become the kind of people that we think there ought to be in the world. Maybe there's a different way of thinking about ethics, about the question how life should be lived, which starts somewhere else. And maybe it should start by thinking about the wow moments. What is an epiphany? When I talk about epiphanies, wow moments is roughly speaking what I mean. You can also call them aha moments, light bulb moments. They can be both epistemic, moments when something suddenly becomes clear to you in your understanding, or they can be intimations of value. They can be moments when you suddenly become aware of something valuable, something worth caring about in your vicinity that in some sense or another you hadn't noticed before. And part of what's obscure about epiphanies is in exactly what sense you hadn't noticed it before. Things can be more or less vivid to us. Things can be more or less striking to us in our daily experience. And I'll just read you something from chapter 1 of the book, which is about a moment when something like that happened to me. And I seem to have form for being someone who arrives in a rush and a hurry at the very last moment, or even a little bit later. Because some years ago, I was giving a talk in London, and I dashed down to London on the train, and my hosts, I think it was LSE, I can't remember, I think I was talking about Aristotle at the LSE, they'd put me up in the Good Enough Club in Bloomsbury. If you ever get a chance to stay there, sell your granny to stay there. It's worth it. And this happened to me. I woke up this morning in an attic room in the Good Enough Club in Mecklenburgh Square in Bloomsbury. I opened the window and looked blearily out. My first impression was vague green and vague cold. Then the cold resolved itself into delightful cool breeze on a sunny London morning, and the green resolved itself into the tall, mature plane trees in the private garden in the middle of that deserted Georgian space. I was 4 flights up, yet my eye level seemed to be little more than halfway up the Great Plains. And from root to leaf tip, these huge trees, planes are a tree I particularly associate with London. They're very urban trees. They're very good at absorbing smog. That's one of the reasons why they were planted, and very good at surviving in smog. And actually, in Epiphanies, I seem to have been exercising an unconscious obsession with planes, because plane trees keep coming up. Anyway, from root to leaf tip, these huge trees were swaying gently in the wind like giant living creatures that secretly dance, like Ents or something, if you're a Tolkien fan. The top of a red crane, visible in the distance above them, was swaying too. I felt like I was on board a tall ship in full sail. I felt like everything I was looking at was charged with life and moving. I got slightly dizzy because my eyes locked onto the plane trees and I was adjusting myself to their plane, and that wasn't the plane of that wasn't the inertial frame of the building I was in, so it seemed like the building was moving. Yes, I walked across Mecklenburgh Square a dozen or 20 times and never even noticed the trees before. So we might loosely say that an epiphany is a moment that makes us glad to be alive. Or we might ask, what are the great small pleasures of your life? And see what people have to say about that. When I asked that question on Facebook a while back now, I got 276 responses, many of them from friends who aren't philosophers and don't know my academic work. And that casts interesting light, I think, on how readily people understand this notion of an epiphany, or perhaps in the case of Mecklenburgh Square, a micro-epiphany, and how very widespread and frequent experiences like that are. And my friends' examples in this Facebook thread, when I asked people, what are the great small pleasures of your life? Things came up like listening to gorse peapod pop in the sun, folding clean laundry, the taste of a really good strawberry, reading in bed, and peeling a ripe conker. So that's the way in. That's just the first bit of this talk. Over and done with. I've given you a way in, I hope, to the notion so that you know roughly what I'm talking about when I talk about epiphanies. I'm talking about moments where you see something that makes you go, wow. And it can be a big wow, and it can be a small wow. And it can be that you see something that you've seen before but never really noticed. Or it can be that you literally see something that you've never seen before. Now, philosophers in general are very keen, for good reasons internal to philosophy. They're generally very keen on necessary and sufficient condition definitions. They're very keen on if and only if, as the jargon has it. So you can find a counterexample to a typical philosophical definition, either by finding that the form of words you've got catches too much. It captures all the phenomena it's supposed to catch, but it also captures something else. Or if that's overdoing the necessary conditions. Or you can find that it overdoes the sufficient conditions, and the sufficient conditions are too strong, so something is excluded by the definition that shouldn't be. I'm not going to try for a necessary and sufficient condition definition of epiphany. Why not? Well, first of all, because people make a bloody nuisance of themselves when you do, because they're constantly coming up with what about this, counterexamples, and you find yourself a moving target in a philosophical coconut shy. Now, that can be all right. I mean, there are cases where that's perfectly appropriate, and of course, when I'm, so to speak, bowling rather than batting, I'm very happy to play that game myself and lob down some nasty stuff and see how the batter deals with it. But in the case of epiphanies, I think there are good reasons for thinking that we've got hold of something which resists formal definition because it isn't formal. It's not something that we can give an all-inclusive, all-exclusive in the right way philosophical account of. It's also because there's another thing that I think philosophers should do more of, as well as mongering necessary and sufficient condition definitions. I think they should also pay close attention to examples. And when I say that, I mean, first of all, that they should try and build accounts of things. In many cases, particularly things that are organic, alive, moving targets, untidy, they should aim to build definitions for those things, or accounts for those things, which start by saying, it's like that. Here's a paradigm example. It's like that, more or less so. And maybe there's a fading away from the central example in various directions. But start with a paradigm case. Start with something that you get, that you understand, and see how you move away from that. And maybe this will be more fruitful than thinking just about necessary and sufficient conditions. Maybe you'll capture more of real interest there, and maybe you won't think the game is just over if and when someone comes up with an ingenious counterexample to what you're saying. That's one reason why I want to do what philosophers call defining by ostension, defining by pointing to a paradigm case and saying, look, this is what we're talking about, and that's what I'm currently doing with the Mecklenburgh Square experience. It's for a second reason too, which is to do with the sociology and the sociology or the socio-psychology, I don't know which, of being a philosopher, which is that every time we consider any issue, we have in our heads a whole background of cases, which is our roster of examples for thinking about this kind of thing. And it's that roster of examples that defines the way we think about it and how it's emotionally toned for us and what inferences we're likely to draw. Just as an example of what I mean here, take abortion. So one side comes to this proverbially heated debate with their heads full of one set of images to do with perhaps fetuses growing inside the mother, newborn babies looking cute, sections of people who are pregnant showing the baby in the womb, that kind of thing. They come to the debate with that. And the other side come to the debate with their heads full of a quite different roster of examples. And that's why they end up very often talking past each other, and that's why both sides end up so angry, because both sides don't understand how the other side can possibly fail to see the emotional power of the set of examples that they're working with. So we, when we're doing philosophy, or when we're thinking about any big issue, we need to be wise to ourselves in just that kind of way. We need to ask ourselves, what set of examples am I thinking about? What set of examples are driving my thinking? What set of examples are providing the emotional petrol, if you like, that keeps me going along the road that I'm going along? What are the examples that are driving me? And so in this book, I do my best to do two things. And one is to provide as wide a range of examples as I possibly can within the constraints of the book. It's already 400 pages long. And without allowing it, I hope, to degenerate just into a laundry list. I try and use all sorts of examples. I try and get a really wide range of examples of epiphanies into the picture because I want people's affective consciousness to be open to, alive to, as wide a possible range of evidence as we can manage. I don't want people just to be focusing on one or two little examples and nothing else. And that, I think, is a weakness of ways we often do philosophy. Philosophers have, as philosophy is currently practiced in the academy, in my experience, I'm sure these criticisms don't apply to the wonderful department that you have at York, but I'm afraid these are tendencies I often see. There's a tendency to focus on just one or two very narrow cases from real life. Worse still, there's a tendency to focus exclusively on cases that aren't from real life at all, but which, for reasons of logical hygiene, as they call it, have been dreamt up by philosophers so that you get, this is often called the method of cases, you get a contrasting pair of cases where there's supposed to be just the one moral difference between us, and that will enable us, according to this method, to pick out what's really going on philosophically in these cases. And very often, as you may know if you looked around the literature, it's what I'm sure I'm being unfairly dismissive, but I tend to call it trolleyology. We've got weird things, weird scenes inside the gold mine. We've got trolleys, which is American for underground trains, careering around, running people over, and you, for some reason, are standing at the lever, and you, for some reason, are the one who has to decide. Now, after all, this whole industry was started by one of my philosophical heroes, Philippa Foot, and after all, this industry is only supposed to demonstrate some very wafer-thin logical points. But nonetheless, it becomes a kind of paradigm of what ethics is all about. And I'm a let 100 flowers bloom kind of girl. I'm happy to say that's one thing we can do in ethics, but woe betide us if it's the only thing we do or the main thing we do. We need to look more widely than that. So that was all about examples. Having said that, here's a definition of epiphany. And this is from Merriam-Webster. So, epiphany. First sense, it's January the 6th, observed as a church festival in commemoration of the coming of the Magi, as the first manifestation of Christ to the Gentiles. Second sense, it's an appearance or manifestation, especially of a divine being. Third sense, it's a usually sudden manifestation or perception of the essential nature or meaning of something. And then it's also, second subsense, an intuitive grasp of reality through something, such as an event, usually simple and striking. Or it's an illuminating discovery, realization, or disclosure, or it's a revealing scene or moment. That's how Merriam-Webster defines the word, which after all is an ordinary part of the English language, and which, as Merriam-Webster points out, in its primary sense, has a religious meaning. Epiphany has a religious meaning, first of all. Now, I think one reason why other analytic philosophers, we're a very secular bunch in analytic philosophy, and there are a number of ways in which I'm a bit of an outlier, perhaps a bit of a heretic. And one of them is that I am well known to be a Christian. And so, of course, the combination of me being a Christian and me wanting to talk about epiphanies sets off all kinds of alarm klaxons in my secular colleagues. And am I here to tell them that they needn't worry and I'm not doing anything that needs to alarm them? I think, what exactly is the nature of the concern? That's often a question that interests me. I think they think I'm sneaking something under their guard, that I'm engaging in a religious contraband exercise and smuggling religious goods into what's supposed to be a hygienically naturalistic area, a hygienically scientistic area. Well, I don't know, maybe I am, maybe I'm not. From my point of view, what it looks to me like I'm doing is looking for points of contact. Because you often get the impression from, as much as anything else, oh God, politics, you often get the impression that religious people and non-religious people are completely different species who have nothing in common. And I think that that is absolutely false. I think it's really importantly false. And I think it's crucial to undermine that impression. So if there's contraband smuggling going on from me, that's the main item I want to get past the censors. I want to get past people's barriers, their inhibitions, the idea that actually there could be a great deal in common between those who call themselves believers and those who do not. And that these moments of revelation where suddenly, and it can be life-changing, where we suddenly see something in a new light, those are moments that people can have whether or not they're Christian. And here is another example of an epiphany. I'll try and do this from memory. It's a famous passage from George Orwell, who is deliberately, studiedly, at times I think, he goes out of his way to be downbeat. He says, for example, that he hates mountains at one point in, that's in Homage to Catalonia. So he deliberately sets out to be someone who's not going to be swayed by any of that woo, any of those voodoo tricks that an unsympathetic hearer might think that I'm offering when I talk about epiphanies. And yet, in Coming Up for Air, Orwell's memoir, of his time as an officer of the British Raj in Burma, there's a very famous essay by Orwell about the execution of a convict. And he says, as I say, I'll try and busk it from memory. He says, "It came to me with great force." This is when they're marching the man to the gallows. "It came to me with great force what we were doing here. This man who breathed and pumped blood and secreted mucus and snot and earwax like the rest of us." Again, this is Orwell being deliberately rubbing our faces in the grubbiness of life. This man who was just like us in so many ways, this man who, as we're marching him across the prison yard, he changes his step in order not to get his feet wet in a puddle on the way. We're marching into the gallows, we're ending his life just like that. How can we do this? And Orwell's talking about the possibility that you might suddenly see that what you're doing in an act which for you is completely routine, you execute people every month. It's nothing special, it's just another execution. It's not just another day at the gallows. But you might come to see in a moment that what you're doing actually has a certain kind of peculiar horror to it. So that's one thing to say about epiphanies. They're not all Andrex advert moments. They're not all Labrador puppies romping through the petals looking cute. They can be moments where something pretty horrifying comes to your mind. And I wanted to say, I used Orwell as an example because I wanted to say that this is something that humans share in common. This is something that humans are all capable of grasping, I believe. I don't think there are humans who don't have epiphanies who are not capable of them. I haven't yet succeeded in finding any. Perhaps there are some, but if you'll forgive the mild ableism, they seem to me to be, if there are people like that, they seem to me to be a little bit like people who are colourblind. Perhaps there's something there that they are missing, rather than it being the case that their failure to pick anything up is an indicator that something's gone wrong. At any rate, I want, when the inevitable scepticism comes back and people say, oh, but how can you show that everyone has the same thing, or that this is a common experience, or how can you show that it's always happening to humans? Lots of people, it will be said, deny it. Well, actually, very often what they seem to be denying is just the word epiphany, for whatever reason. When the inevitable skepticism comes back about epiphanies, I do want to leave open the possibility that we might say, look, there is a kind of ability here that humans in general have, and if some people don't have that ability, that doesn't show that there's something suspect about the ability. The ability, it shows there's something deficient in their sensibilities. And as I say, with colourblind, this isn't a matter of blame or fault or treating anyone as a second-class citizen. It's a matter of recognising that humans vary in their capacities. And even Orwell, who seems to me to have been monstrously tone-deaf about mountains, I mean, to me, saying that you hate mountains or mountains are horrible, it's just blasphemy. And why on earth Orwell spent his time trying to recover from TB on the island of Jura, of all places, if he hated mountains? He could at least have gone to a flat Scottish island. But anyway, so what I'm wanting to say is that perhaps in looking at epiphanies, we might be able to home in on something which has a kind of unificatory power for human beings. It might be that we human beings can find that these are areas where we all have something in common, and areas where there's something going on that we can join in too. And as evidence of that possibility, I want to bring out two further thoughts about epiphanies. The first is that epiphanies are not necessarily, in any way, individual. And perhaps it's Wordsworth, wandering lonely as a cloud, and talking about an epiphany of daffodils that has made us think. Perhaps it's the Romantics who've made us think that epiphanies are quintessentially solitary experiences. But my answer to that is absolutely not at all. And if you go to any theatre, any good theatre, or if you go to any football ground, well, any good team's football ground, you will witness people sharing in what are, hopefully, epiphanic experiences. Maybe not if it's Leeds playing, but I have to get in that local dig. But if it's my own team, Celtic, playing, then definitely epiphany is very much on the cards. And it's shared epiphanies. That's the point I'm getting at in this flippant way. That a lot of the time, the epiphanies we share in are not individual experiences, they're collective. One of the most ancient forms of epiphany, this is the second point I wanted to come to, that collective epiphanies are something that you see throughout human experience, and Even the most reductive-minded psychologist is going to say that part of their sociological function is social binding. So think of a very famous form of epiphanic event, the Athenian drama festivals that gave us the plays of Aeschylus, Euripides, and Sophocles. And I didn't say those out of order, by the way. Euripides and Sophocles were contemporaries. And I think Sophocles' last play may even have happened after Euripides. Yes, it did. What happened in the Greek theatre is that social glue of the strongest kind was applied to the people of Athens by the fact that they were sharing an epiphanic experience. And this certainly happens at football matches. This certainly happens at rock concerts. This certainly happens also in religious contexts, in services. Think, to move outside my own religion for a moment, think about the enormous unifying force within Islam of circling round the Kaaba in Mecca, circling round that lump of meteorite stone, which for Muslims is the center of the world, the center of their faith, and think about the way in which the whole of that religion is unified by this experience. So epiphanies are not necessarily individual, and in fact they may be more corporate. They may have been corporate, collective, for longer than they've been individual. And what do? Well, this is where we get to ethical theory. This is where we get to specific ethical claims. I'm saying that epiphanies are a way of grasping value. And I mean that pretty literally. I think that in epiphanies, we come face to face with something which is important with a capital I. We come face to face with something which is the right kind of thing to be part of what gives life meaning with a capital M, maybe even what tells us about the meaning of life with 4 capitals. So in grasping epiphanies, we're grasping something that goes to the heart of things. Whether they're collective or individual, it's still a kind of grasp that we naturally do share with others, and when it happens solitarily, we naturally want to share it. This is a thing that friends do. Did you see that? It's one of the most characteristic things that friends say to each other, because they want to share what they've seen, because they want to share what they've experienced, and they want that value to be something that they have in common with other human beings. So one of Plato's friends, Archytas of Tarentum, who was one of the rulers of whom Plato hoped to make a philosopher ruler, and Plato, luckily for his friendship with Archytas, Plato never tried installing laws in Tarentum. Plato did try installing laws in Dion's city, in Syracuse, not the one in New York, the one in Sicily. And that was the end of his friendship, that things went very badly wrong. But Archytas and Plato remained friends, and one of the things that Archytas said, it's recorded by Cicero in his book on friendship, one of the things he said is that even if you went up to the highest heavens and saw the most beautiful things that anyone can see, if you had no friend to share the experience with, to share your vision of the highest heavens with, then it would be worth nothing. Now, the last bit, I think, is exaggeration, but it's telling that Archytas, who was, after all, reported by Cicero, and Cicero might misreport him, there's a small matter of 700 years between them. Sorry, no, a small matter of 400 years between them. It's exaggeration, but nonetheless, there has to be something to the idea that sharing our epiphanies makes them more powerful, gives them sticking power, makes them more like the kind of foundation that we can share in for a social order. But now I do want to talk about politics, and I'm going to stop talking at 7, and we can have a discussion. But I want to talk about politics because one of the best ways of answering the obvious question that comes up about what I'm saying about epiphanies is to think about civil society and to think about how we get on together in civil society. Because different subgroups It's not always going to be like the whole city of Athens or all its citizens having the same experience watching Aeschylus at the city Dionysia. It's never going to be as rosy as that. I think even Hegel, who is one of the great progenitors of this idea of Athens as a place of uniquely unified civic values, even Hegel recognized that it's not quite that neat. And of course, in every Hegelian ointment, there is always a fly, because without the fly, you won't produce, the ointment won't go off, and unless the ointment goes off, you won't be able to produce the next Hegelian ointment. Hegel is all about succession and one thing turning into another. That's what dialectic is supposed to be. But suppose you have a society radically divided about epiphanies. Suppose it's not just that you and I, maybe me and George Orwell, disagree about whether mountains are beautiful and epiphanic. Maybe it's that we have a society-wide disagreement about our vision of value, about what we should prize in human life, about what matters, about how to live together as humans. My claim has been, it is in the book, and though I haven't pressed very hard on it here, it's what I'm saying. My claim is that it's epiphanies, above all, that shape our societies politically. It's the founding visions that make us the people we are and the societies we are. And in the case of the post-war consensus, as we still call it, I think there's a good case to be made for saying, I don't think I'm the first person to say this by any means, that it was the horrors of Nazi rule in the Second World War that made the modern world what it was. We looked at that, we looked at Auschwitz, and we said never again. We said this cannot be allowed ever to happen again. We must found a society, central to which is an understanding of this profound, this almost unbearable dis-epiphany. This is one of the reasons why I say epiphanies can be very negatively valenced. It's horror at that kind of possibility that makes the post-war consensus a vision that until quite recently has been broadly shared. And it's something like forgetfulness of that shared vision that has been the foundation of our society. I mean, if I was a provocative and troublemaking philosopher, perhaps I'd say that Hitler wrote the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Fortunately, I'm not a troublemaking or fractious philosopher, so I won't say that. But there is a kind of truth to the idea that it's because we are responding to that horror that we share the values we do, and that we make the affirmations we do of the basic dignity of all humans, the basic equality of all humans, the importance of the rule of law, the importance of mutual recognition and respect, the importance of not letting politics degenerate into the slinging around of terms like fascist and racist and nothing else. It's because we've been through, interesting we. How many people are alive now who actually were alive during the Second World War? But we want to say, we have been through that, never again. We will found ourselves a society that rejects that vision. Now, of course, as time goes on, people die off, things are forgotten, new epiphanies and new senses of what's valuable come to the fore. Populations change, and however much some of our politicians may hate the fact, ethnic change happens all the time and always has, and new peoples, new cultures, bring with them new epiphanies and new senses of what's valuable. How are we to negotiate all that? Well, this is where I think, for me at any rate, democracy and the rule of law are not just something that is the content of an epiphany. They're also, so to speak, there's something that we need to value at a meta-epiphany level, above and beyond all our particular visions of what is valuable and of how to respect each other as humans and of how to live together and of what values to base our living together on. There has to be a sense that, as well as holding fervently to whatever we do hold to, we also need to be prepared to have a certain sense of irony about ourselves. So I'm just writing my responses. I'm doing a book symposium on Epiphanies for the Journal of the Philosophy of Emotion. And one of the challenges that I'm facing there is the epiphanies that Chappell talks about are exigent epiphanies. They're demanding epiphanies. Chappell wants to talk, and I do want to talk, about a republic, a conversation. That's the chapter titled of my last chapter, my chapter 8. Chappell wants to say that however prized your vision, however central to your vision, to your living and your values, your vision may be, you've got to be prepared to discuss that vision with people who disagree fundamentally with you. You've got to be prepared to afford to other people a kind of respect, which takes their freedom to disagree with you as a basic part of the conversation. So, when we do that, what results? Well, this is a whole area of modern political theory that we're into here, and it has something to do with the kind of ethics of discourse that people like Habermas have propounded in Germany, and in a different way John Rawls has propounded in America. It's about negotiating with each other. It's about respecting our differences and learning to live together. And then the question is, and this is the question I want to close with, the question will keep coming back. So what are you going to do, Chappell, about differences between people's epiphanies of what's valuable? And aren't you caught in your own picture? Don't you have to be an imperialist about your own vision? If it's that important to you, why are you not imposing it on other people? So one of my critics in this book symposium says, you talk about the Republic of Conversation, but since epiphanies are so gripping according to you, it ought to be more like the empire of conversation. You ought to be empire building. And I reject that. And the reason why, and this is the last thing I'm going to say, was summed up by someone who is, for me, a lot less than a hero, and someone about whom I feel extremely ambivalent, especially having just visited the southwest of Ireland. And that's Oliver Cromwell, who said in negotiation with the Scottish Covenanters, when they were trying to impose their religious system on everybody else, they were imperialists in this sense. And Cromwell's letter back to the Covenanters included the glorious phrase, I beseech you, brothers, in the bowels of Christ, consider it possible ye may be mistaken. Consider it possible ye may be mistaken. That is what I want to take from relativism. I said earlier on in this talk that I'm a let 100 flowers bloom kind of girl, and that tends to mean that I think there's some truth somewhere in most of the positions that are offered, and it's just a matter of digging it out, maybe by a process of conversation and negotiation. And in relativism, in a writer like Richard Rorty, for example, there is the notion of irony. There is the notion of sitting light to your own preoccupations and your own blinding visions and your own epiphanies. And that's something I want to say about my own. I mean, I have my own epiphanies, I have my own strong views about what's right and what's wrong, based on my vision of value. But I think one of the crucial things that liberalism gives us, and one of the crucial reasons why liberal relativism, which is a phrase usually said with a sneer, actually has something valuable to contribute to the conversation, is precisely this sense that you need to be mature enough to recognize at the same time both that something may be life and death to you, mountains, for example, and also that it might not mean a fig to other people, George Orwell, for example. Let me stop there and open it up to you.